Alex. We're here to talk about Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered on PC. Now, we didn't actually get to see the game on PC until launch, which is kind of strange because we saw the PS5 version like 2 weeks earlier. However, going into this one, I was thinking, well, all of the hard work has been done already for Horizon Forbidden West. Nixxes know what they're doing. PC versions should be pretty good, therefore. And I would like you to validate that, please.
I'll validate it off the, just normally validate it. Yeah, sure. It is a Nixxes port, so it's going to have a lot of the Nixxes stuff, and it is technologically extremely similar to Horizon Forbidden West. And the menu system, the launcher, all the options are basically everything you saw in Horizon Forbidden West, except now there's also a anti-lag 2 option you can select, which is new to my knowledge.
Interesting.
But yeah, so I wanted to check out the game really briefly on a Ryzen 5 3600 RTX 4060 PC because it's kind of our console analog PC, as well as it throws up a number of bottlenecks occasionally with regards to the CPU, as well as with 8 GB GPU VRAM there. So I loaded it up, and there's a couple of things that are slightly different than Horizon Forbidden West. Namely, there seems to be an unskippable cutscene at the beginning, just like there was originally back in the day when the original port launched all those years ago. How long ago it was, I don't remember. But during that time, there's actually a shader pre-compilation sequence that occurs. One thing that I do find a little bit annoying, though, about the pre-rendered sequences in the game is they are running at 30 FPS. Quality of them isn't so great, and I don't think the playback is perfect as well. I think this is something we talked about. Even John might have talked about it a bit in his video. Just like they don't look as good as the gameplay, which runs at 60. And it especially even on, like, I was just targeting 1440p on this machine, using the high settings I also included the parallax occlusion mapping. And the high settings are very similar to those that are found on the PlayStation 5's performance mode, as I found back in my review back then, except the default now on PC for high includes something like 16 times anisotropic filtering, which it never used to do, actually. So they've changed what the high preset is. But yeah, those intro like FMV cutscenes that are found all throughout the first chapter as well, I think during chapter transitions usually, they don't look too great and they don't run too great and they're not so awesome. But at least when you get into gameplay there, or at least the initial opening cutscenes, there's a couple things that I already noticed that are kind of typical Nixxes port stuff, but they're also typical to Horizon games, and specifically the first one. Like some of the transitions between the various camera cuts are a little awkward. That's still in there to a good degree. Yeah. Also, the way dynamic resolution scaling works in the current Nixxes games, at least as far as I could tell, is that you set dynamic resolution scaling. Like, for example, I did 1440p DLSS dynamic resolution scaling for 60 FPS, and the upper bounds always seems to be 1440p native, and that is a high resolution. So sometimes when it'll end one camera cut to another, there'll be a period of dropped frames that, there's always like a kind of a dropped frame in between camera cuts, but there's also sometimes a number of them after a camera cut as dynamic resolution switches to something quite a bit lower usually. So, and then you can find that also happening in the gameplay. Like if you just twist the camera really quickly, you'll often see just like a sputtering, like of a couple drop frames here or there down to like 58 FPS for a second. Obviously on a VRR display, this doesn't really matter too much, but one thing I've been trying to argue for in the last couple of years with Nixxes Sports is that I wish there was a bit more control over dynamic resolution, because currently it's goes up to a resolution that is just your output resolution, and there's no control over how aggressive it is. And I think it would be great to allow people to choose how high res it goes as well as how aggressive it is, because honestly, quality mode DLSS already looks really good. There's almost no reason to let it float above that unless you really want it. So that's one thing I really wish they had. But otherwise, GPU limited in game primarily running around the game world, just as here and there, a couple of drop frames, primarily just from the GPU when I'd move the camera too quickly, or something big would happen on screen really quickly, which would cause like one tiny little VSync frame drop. Nothing bad at all. Really great for VRR. Another thing that I noticed is that the game starts with the sharpening slider, which applies to DLSS as well here. Just applies to everything, set to like 5 out of 10. And I thought the game looked a bit crunchy at 1440p, so turning that down is something I would maybe recommend to people in the audience. Just looked a little bit crunchy on like a desktop monitor distance. One thing that I also wanted to talk about is that they describe it in their blog. I can't remember if John talked about it in his video, but they added a lot more just random NPCs into areas. Yep. They definitely have a CPU burden. And if you go, for example, I was running towards the first little town in the prologue area of the game, and I noticed like frame drop as I was running towards the town, or as I got near the town. I was like, GPU seems fine here. I loaded up the game again, same settings, but just ultra low resolution, like ridiculously low resolution to be CPU bottlenecked on the RTX 4060. And indeed, if you get into that town, that first little town, I think it's called like Mother's Heart or something like that. I forget the name of the town. But yeah, it's CPU limited on a Ryzen 5 3600 below 60 FPS with slightly unstable frame times. They're not bad frame times, but they're a little bit more unstable than the rest of the world. And just running around, it's like in the 50s there. And just running around the game world, I did notice in the prologue area that the Ryzen 5 3600 on these high settings is just above 60 FPS quite often. You wouldn't notice it, obviously, with good frame capping or with VSync usually, but it's like just there sometimes, like 70, 80 at the most, but sometimes it's like right at 60, which is pretty intense because at its heart, this is a PS4 game, but they have now added so much, I guess, but NPC density, as well as just greater density overall, that the game now is actually quite a CPU challenge, I would argue, in comparison to what it used to be.
I'd be curious to see Meridian on there, on the PC performance, because I actually ran out of time, but I actually looked at this where in the original, when you enter Meridian, there's that large bridge. It's pretty much empty. There's like a couple guards patrolling. There's basically nothing happening. Whereas in the new version, there's like dozens of NPCs now, like doing stuff. Right. And you get into the city and it's basically they ramped up the number of NPCs in the scene. So everything is way more congested and busier. It does not drop below 60 on the PS5. But I'm wondering if on that CPU, if you'd be struggling a little bit more. I mean,
I could just grab a save after this and do a really quick test, and you may be seeing it here, and we may be seeing this. But I would have based upon the fact that this smaller little town area had some views that were in the 50s. I would imagine the Ryzen 5 3600 is suffering similarly there, if not worse, based upon the fact that Meridian's, I think, the largest city in the game. Actually, here's Alex with some editing room shenanigans. I did load up the game with a later save from Meridian, and there, when running to the city, I noticed some strange performance actually happening, some bad performance on the Ryzen 5 3600 when CPU limited here at this ultra low resolution. Basically, running in, it goes below 60 rather noticeably, and it kind of moved the frame rate down there in a way I didn't really expect. I did expect lower frame rates, but not like this. And the behavior is essentially, as we can see here, sitting still above 60 FPS, completely fine. Start moving the camera through Meridian in just kind of a slightly more erratic way. Completely CPU limited, is dropping down into the 40s and 30s. Camera goes steady again, and we're above 60 FPS. And this behavior is what I noticed on the Ryzen 5 3600 while in Meridian here. It really didn't show up earlier in the game to such an intense degree, but in the city, definitely does. Basically, for some reason, moving the camera, even while staying mainly in the exact same place, really dips the performance hard on the CPU, doubling the load. Just even though I'm more or less staying in the same place, it's just the camera's moving. So pretty bad performance there on the Ryzen 5 3600, and let's hope and see if Nixxes can do anything about that. Maybe not. Overall, though, I would say it is a great effort. I didn't think there were any really big problems. There are some things I didn't get to test because of the amount of time. I know one thing I've talked about in the past is like camera movement when combined with things like DLSS 3 isn't always perfect in Nixxes games.
All right.
I did not get to test that, but maybe people in the audience have. This is just kind of like me just dipping my feet into the water here. But my impressions are very positive. I found it better looking than the original game, better looking than the original PC release. I liked that Aloy's, head when she's a child is like normal sized. Something I immediately noticed. Our head seemed a little bit smaller. I think it's a great looking game now. And yeah, the LOD also just felt better too. Like in the first game, you'd like run forward on like paths, and you could notice like the ground deforming ahead of you. And I didn't really notice that so much here. So they definitely push things up.
Smaller heads, it's the kind of technical critique that millions come to Digital Foundry
That's why
for.
I'm here.
It sounds pretty good, and I guess it finally puts a full stop at the end of a story that began with some pretty sorry performance on PC. That original port was kind of lashed into shape by Nixxes, but this is kind of like the way forward, really. And I think the same $10 upgrade applies.
Yes, it does. It does
versus the original.
Cool.
Okay, so yeah, that's pretty fantastic.